Looking deeper into the impeachment question and Ukraine's connection to it is Lee Stranahan. He's joining us from Northern Virginia. Lee, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate it. Great to see you.
Lee is the host with Garland Nixon of Fault Lines, a must listen to if you can get up that early. But if you can't, you can see it on their Periscope throughout the day on Twitter or on YouTube. And if you're night owls and you get up later, you could still catch it, and it's relevant throughout the whole day. So thanks, Lee, for coming on. We want to talk to you, obviously, about we spoke with Scott Ritter in depth about the whistleblower. He's working on a big piece for us, and we went into it. Of course, Ukraine came up, but I want to focus mostly on Ukraine with you because you showed a lot of expertise in this area, more than a lot of other people, and you could explain some basic things to us. So one thing I said to Scott was that there's a kind of bipartisan cover-up about the first act in this drama, which was the overthrow of Yanukovych with U.S. help, a violent overthrow. Right after that, in a colonial takeover of a country, all these people started getting big jobs, like Joe Biden's son on the board. A couple of months after Biden being the point man, according to Victoria Nuland in her leaked conversation with Jeffrey Piot, the American ambassador, that Biden played a key role in this coup. That you're not going to hear in this impeachment hearing or on Fox or on MSC or anybody else, are we, Lee?
No, you're not. And part of the reason is there isn't, well, first off, let's call this what it is. This is obviously a CIA operation. What we're witnessing up on Capitol Hill, it's not even really Congress or the Democrats running it. It's the CIA. And the reason I say that is because the one thing we absolutely know about the whistleblower, the Times confirmed it the next day, is they work in Langley. So whether the CIA whistleblower is one specific person, we know that they're CIA. We had John McLaughlin, the former head of the CIA, saying in a speech in Virginia 2 weeks ago, thank God for the deep state. And you had John Brennan on that same panel take credit for this again and say, these are the brave men and women of the CIA stepping forward. So this is a CIA operation, first off. And we had Larry Johnson on my show a couple weeks ago talking about the Trump task force that he set up in 2015, 2016. And he's got CIA, Larry Johnson, former CIA analyst there. He has sources that say this is an explicit task force. So how does this work? So when I say the CIA, it's also elements of the Clinton land. It's also elements of the State Department. So let's go back to 2008. Hillary Clinton thought she should have been president that year, but Barack Obama stole it from her, in her opinion. And then she managed to get herself into the Obama administration. One of the first things she does is she sets up that private email server in Chappaqua. Now, it's important to note that she never used a government-issued email once. The only email she used was that private server. And that allowed her, and don't forget, she also destroyed 33,000 emails after the State Department said, hey, we need those emails for FOIA requests. Then she destroyed them. So one of the things that she was hiding, and you'll see why this is very relevant in a second, is that she maintained a relationship, a working professional relationship with Sid Blumenthal. And this is going to be very important in a second. And she had to hide that from Obama. And that's one of the things we know, and I'll talk about how we know in a second. And the reason she had to hide that is Obama did not like Blumenthal after the 2008 primary, where he was the guy who started the Obama in a turban thing, and that was Blumenthal, right? So the reason we know that about Sid Blumenthal and Hillary Clinton communicating is that the original Goosifer, Marcel, that guy who's now in prison right down the street from me, hacked Sidney Blumenthal's emails. And one of the things that came out in that hack of Sid Blumenthal's emails was that Sid was working with a guy named Cody Sheera. Now, let's talk about who Cody Sheera is. Cody Sheera is one of Bill Clinton's oldest friends. His brother, Derek Shearer, was an ambassador to Finland. I'll talk about that. Brooke Shearer worked with Hillary directly. She was on the bus in the 92 campaign. But what's interesting about Cody Shearer is not just that he was involved in 2016. which he was, where he came up with the first, not the second, the first dossier. He came up with the dossier that was the template for Christopher Steele. And I'll talk about that in a second. But Cody Sheera is interesting because his father was Lloyd Shearer, who ran Personality Parade, Walter Scott's Personality Parade. The most Parade magazine that used to come, Sunday paper, 50 to 75 million readers, one of the most influential. And actually, the guy who wrote a really good article about this in '96 was Tucker Carlson. Young Tucker Carlson wrote an article about how Personality Parade was used to push Bill Clinton. And there's a reason for that. Bill Clinton became friends with the Shearers after his Oxford roommate was a guy named Strobe Talbott. Now, Strobe Talbott was also briefed in 2016 by Steele. I'll come back to Strobe in a second. But you got to understand that this is Bill Clinton's Oxford roommate, tutored him in Russian stuff before he went to the USSR. And he married Cody Shearer's twin sister, Brooke Shearer. So these people go back. Cody Shearer, Brooke Shearer's passed away now, but Cody Shearer and Strobe Talbott literally go back with Clinton to 1968, literally that far back, okay? And so how does this fit into 2016? What's going on here? Well, we found out that Sid Blumenthal was working with Cody Shearer on Libya in those leaked emails that came out from Goose. So, and we also know for a fact Cody Shearer created the first dossier in 2016. And he also talked to a former CIA agent named Bear in Colorado about this dossier that he put together, which had the same, Lee Smith over at Real Clear Investigations did a good piece on this. He's actually seen that Shearer dossier. Smith gets some stuff wrong. This story, he got a lot of stuff right. Shearer put together this dossier, which included like the sexual allegations against Trump, and he was talking to people about it in March. Now, so let's look at that. Here's March 2016. We know Steele doesn't get hired until May or June. And we know he doesn't start working until June. That's when his first dated thing is. So the Shearer dossier is referred to as the second dossier because people find out about it second. They know, everyone knows about the Steele dossier, but this was actually the first dossier, and it was created by one of Bill Clinton's oldest friends who was working with Sid Blumenthal. And here's another interesting trivia note. Guccifer 1, the original Guccifer, Marcel, said in an interview when he was being extradited from Romania to Virginia, he said this in an interview. He said a State Department official said to him, so how would you feel if another Guccifer just appeared? That's what, again, I'm not verifying.
That's incredible. Please continue.
And it's right. It's incredible, and it's all out there. So who would have reason to be pissed off at that first Guccifer? Hillary Clinton, because by the way, one of the other things that Sid Blumenthal leak revealed was that they had lied about, they had told Congress, Hillary Clinton had said, oh, no, or the Obama administration, I think it said, we didn't know about that email until after. And this showed emails going back and forth clearly at that Clinton email address. So that put lie to that. So there was a lot of people who had a lot of reason to want revenge here. So, and revenge actually factors in, not to go all Game of Thrones here, but it's a big factor here in this. Now, there were 3 people who were briefed by Steele in 2016. Strobe Talbott, Bill Clinton's college roommate, head of the Brookings Institution for 20 years. We'll come back to that. Victoria Nuland, we know that because she said so. By the way, how do we know Strobe was briefed? Christopher Steele said so in court papers in London. In sworn court papers, Christopher Steele said he was briefing Strobe Talbott. So let's get that out of the way. We know that from Steele. We know it from Nuland because she appeared on Face the Nation and said she had been updated by Steele while at State Department. The third person is Jonathan Weiner. Jonathan Weiner is the attorney for Bill Browder, who people see all the time. The Magnitsky Act is about Bill Browder. Weiner's the guy who put that together. And Weiner was being updated by Christopher Steele. By the way, both Strobe Talbott and Jonathan Weiner have known Steele for about a decade. And you can read that in the New Yorker profile of Christopher Steele. The very bottom, Strobe Talbot is interviewed, said, I've known Chris Steele for 10 years. You can trust this guy. And Weiner said so in an article called Devin Nunes is Investigating Me, Here's the Truth. That's in the Washington Post last year. So we know that 3 State Department people, Victoria Nuland, Strobe Talbot, Wallet State, because don't forget, Strobe served in Clinton's State Department and Obama's, and Jonathan Weiner, Wallet State, all were being briefed by Christopher Steele. Now, they weren't being briefed, and I've reported this before, and I won't go into this, but we know actually who wrote the Steele dossier. It was a Ukrainian named Vasily Filipchuk. I've talked about him before. Let's leave that aside because it's all made up anyway. Cody Sheera had started it. Now, okay, so now let's cut to Ukraine. But let's go back a step before we get to that because Russia's really important here. So you talked about how I had Mark Slobod on and we were talking about this. This is one of those things people can find out in about 2 seconds. So first off, people need to know what Yukos Oil is, Y-U-K-O-S. Yukos Oil is the biggest oil company in Russia. And after the Soviet Union fell, it was bought by a guy named Mikhail Khodorkovsky. Now, it's a long, scary Russian-sounding name. But if people want to remember the name Khodorkovsky, you just have to remember the number 322. 322. I'm not talking about Skull and Bones, the secret society at Yale. No, I'm talking about Senate Resolution 322. Interesting number, but okay. From 2005. And if you read that, then you go, okay, I'm going to type in Senate Resolution 322, and you'll see it's about Khodorkovsky. It says his name right there, Khodorkovsky. Now, you'll notice, by the way, that this is a resolution in favor of this Russian billionaire oligarch, money laundering criminal, Khodorkovsky. That's who he is. And it's interesting because it's got 1 sponsor and 2 co-sponsors. It's not like 20 people sponsored it. No, just 1 sponsor, Joe Biden. 2 co-sponsors in 2005, John McCain and Barack Obama. So both of the future presidential candidates in 2008, anybody can look this up on congress.gov or whatever it is, 322, 2005, that's who sponsored it. So in this era when everyone's afraid of Russians, you'd think somebody would have done a story, even like a human interest story, like, hey, John McCain and Barack Obama don't agree on much while they run against each other in 2008, but they did agree on this one thing that we found really easily. Nobody's ever done a story on this. And so why? What's going on? So what happened was Khodorkovsky took over Yukos Oil, and he took it over in the skeeziest way possible. It was going to be auctioned by a bank. So he bought the bank, and then he threw everybody else out of the auction. It is truly unbelievable, but it really happened, and people can look it up. So he bought for like, I think 400 million, a company that's worth billions and billions. And then after Putin came in, so now you got to remember, this is the 90s in Russia, horrible time, everyone's broke, people are stealing money hand over fist, including Larry Summers, Treasury Secretary under Clinton was a big part of that. So now Putin comes in, and they thought Putin was another pushover. The oligarchs who put people in place, Berezovsky, Khodorkovsky, these guys, they thought Putin was another pushover. Sure enough, Putin goes, no. And he stops the theft. And one of the things he does is he puts Khodorkovsky in prison, and he nationalizes Yukos Oil. Now, what everybody can look up is if you look up Yukos, because it's easier to spell than Khodorkovsky, Y-U-K-O-S, Jacob Rothschild, you've heard of him. All of Khodorkovsky's shares in Yukos went to Rothschild. This is not controversial. Times of London, everybody, that's the reality. So what does that mean? So let's ponder this for a second. So now Jacob Rothschild has $13.5 billion in Yukos oil stock that is worthless because the company's been nationalized. But if you can get rid of Putin and put in people who will denationalize Yukos, problem solved. Jacob Rothschild's shares are then worth, because Yukos, by the way, let's talk about how big they are. At one point, Yukos, this is according to Khodorkovsky's own website. You can go read a lot of this stuff at khodorkovsky.org. 2% of the entire world's oil production, 2% came out of Yukos at one point. That's significant. So this is a major company, and there's a lot of money at stake here. So back in the 90s, the people in charge of Russia policy were Strobe Talbot. He was going to be the ambassador, but he ended up being a deputy secretary of state. He leaves there and goes to run Brookings Institution, where for 20 years, a woman works with him named Fiona Hill. Fiona Hill was just talked about today by George Kent as being, Joe was talking about, like some sort of hero. Well, okay, once you start to actually understand the players here, you go, okay, Strobe Talbot wants to get rid of Putin. You go up to YouTube, type in Strobe Talbot Putin, you'll find 20 videos. He wants to get rid of him. And they don't want to get rid of him because for any reason that they tell you. It's not about human rights. It's not about killing journalists. It's not about Litvinenko. People forget, by the way, that Litvinenko's handler and the guy who, I don't know if you know this. Do you guys know who said Putin was the one responsible for killing Litvinenko? Do you have a guess, Elizabeth?
No, not at all. But I'm yeah, hear
Steele,
it.
Christopher Steele.
Christopher Steele is the right answer, Joe. Congratulations. Christopher Steele is the guy. So the same small group of players come up over and over again. When you need to blame Putin for something, Steele's your guy. Or his partner in Orbis, Pablo Miller, who was Sergei Skripal's handler, but I won't even get into the Skripal case that came up in the middle of all this. Duh, it's Orbis. It's once again, it's Christopher Steele. So you've got the same group of people, Talbot, the Shearers are operatives. Cody Sheera is an operative. And that's his job. And again, he's done this in the 92 campaign. And if anybody wants to get a deep dive into who the Shearers are, there was a letter that was actually published. Derek Shearer, after Clinton got elected, didn't feel like he was getting his due. He sent the most amazing letter on Occidental College Stationery, where he's a professor, and said basically, at the first sentence is like, I believe in political debts. He said, I believe in political friendships, and I also believe in political debts. And he outlines, this is what I did, this is what Cody did, this is what Brooke did, we did this for you, I want an ambassadorship, Finland would work, and 6 months later is the ambassador to Finland. But the letter is amazing, and it really outlines how he would put articles in Parade magazine that Derek Shearer would write, and that his father would post under Walter Scott's name. It's amazing how deep the Clinton media operation runs. And by the way, runs to, the reason I mentioned Parade is it kind of shows the media genius, which is, it's one thing to get the wonks and the people who read Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. It's another thing to get your grandmother, right? So that's what they were going for. And they would print things in Personality Parade like, is it true that Bill Clinton's a womanizer? No, not at all. And so that's what they were doing. And actually, Cy Hirsch was the great investigative reporter, was a friend of Lloyd Shearer's. And he said, Lloyd taught me that it's not all about it's not all about politics. And knowing Cy just the tiniest little bit, that sounds like a backhanded insult to me. Just a little bit. That sounds like Cy going, okay. Because obviously Shearer was doing a different thing, but Cy realized the power of that thing. So the Shearer family could not be more important. And we know that they were involved because, again, that Shearer dossier is admitted by Jonathan Weiner. Now, let's go through this. Jonathan Weiner admits in the Washington Post, he says, I was approached in 2016 by my friend Sid Blumenthal. He said he had a dossier from a journalist I did not know named Cody Sheera. I was so disturbed by the dossier that I gave it to Chris Steele, who then turned it over to the FBI. So let's go over that again. Blumenthal, Shearer to Blumenthal, Blumenthal to Weiner, Weiner to Steele, Steele to the FBI. Now, if this is so disturbing, why not just have Cody Sheera walk down to the FBI and say, hey, I put together this dossier? And the answer is, it's information laundering. They didn't want people to know that this had come from a top Clinton operative. And they've managed to marvelously succeed in not letting almost any of the public know that. But Jonathan Weiner admits it completely in that Washington Post article. So the reason I mention all this stuff is you got to understand what was actually happening in Ukraine. When people demonize Putin, and I'm going to use that term, and because every story I've looked into, and I work for Russia, I know. I host a show on Sputnik, but I was not hired. I didn't know any of this stuff till after I worked for Russia, where I was never worried I would go into work and I'd go, hey, it seems like all this stuff about Putin's BS. And they'd go, oh, darn it, you're onto us. No, so I wasn't worried about that. So I just pursued it. Every single story I've ever seen about Putin, all the bad stuff, Syria, Putin was right in Syria. I knew that from my reporting going over to Lebanon in 2013. Ukraine, Putin was right in Ukraine. They were going to do ethnic cleansing. After the US overthrew the government, there was a group of people who were going to go down and murder people in Crimea and murder people in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass region of Ukraine. That's what they wanted to do. And this is a history that we have of backing people like Lebed. Mykola Lebed was protected by the CIA for years, and people can look that up, Lebed, CIA.
By the way, I just want to interrupt. They did kill people in that Union building, if you know, in
right.
I can't remember the town now, in the south of Ukraine on the coast. So they did start killing people anyway. No,
absolutely. The massacre after the soccer match is what you're referring to. And I forget the Odessa massacre.
That's correct. Odessa, over 45 people burned alive, and the New York Times couldn't bother reporting it. But anyway, go on, please.
No, that's right. So there's so much stuff. And Lebed was a war criminal. Mykola Lebed, he died where many war criminals die, of course, in Pittsburgh, protected by the CIA. But Lebed was a war criminal, and the Village Voice ran an article on him in like the early 80s. And the CIA helped cover up his war criminal background because they wanted to help Uncle Louis, which is what they called him. But he was the worst kind of war criminal. When I say killed pregnant women, stuffed animals in their bodies, really responsible for absolutely reprehensible hundreds of thousands of people. And he's a hero. Lebed is not only protected by the CIA, but he's a hero to these Banderites in Ukraine that do the Tiki Torch marches every January 1st. That didn't start in Charlottesville. That started in Ukraine, where they do them on January 1st in honor of Stefan Bandera's birthday. And so these Banderites, and Lebed was one of them. Lebed was the guy who did the dirty work.
Sorry, Lee. Bandera was, of course, the fascist leader in Ukraine during the Second World War, who's revered by many people in Ukraine today, unfortunately, after the coup.
Yeah, and still revered. Like I say, they do a Tiki Torch march in his honor every January 1st, and that's where they got it from. By the way, John McCain and Lindsey Graham spent January 1st, 2016 in Kyiv, in Ukraine. They were there. And yeah, that's not an accident. They were not just, where should we spend New Year's? They know what's going on. And as I say, the CIA in their own archives talks about how they protected Lebed, the historian guy over at the CIA. The truth eventually gets out. So what they did in Ukraine was, using that secret email system, a number of people, Nuland, who by the way, don't forget, worked for Strobe Talbot. This is very important. Victoria Nuland worked for two people. In the Clinton White House, she worked for Strobe Talbot. Victoria Nuland also worked for Dick Cheney. Now, that's significant if I got into the Genie Energy thing, but Dick Cheney's got a long role in covering up CIA activities, specifically, and people forget this, Cheney and Rumsfeld, a young, spelter Dick Cheney and Rumsfeld, were involved in the 70s during the church hearings after the Frank Olson story came out. When the Frank Olson story about the murdered scientist in Maryland who was thrown out of the window of the hotel in New York in, I believe, 1953. I want to say that's the year, but I could be off by a year or two. But Frank Olson was murdered. He was dosed with LSD. Then he was murdered by the CIA. Then it was covered up for years. His family had no idea what happened to him. They thought he'd killed himself. Then that started to come out in the church hearings. One of the guys who covered that up specifically was Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld. And a lot of people forget that. But Cheney doesn't just have the association with former CIA Director H.W. Bush, but he's explicitly got that history. And Nuland worked for him. And all, of course, she's married to Robert Kagan as well. So Nuland makes perfect sense that she's in on this operation. Make perfect sense that she, along with Steele, along with Talbot and along with Weiner, both who know Steele, were being updated on this. So the operation that we're really seeing play out now, what we're watching on Capitol Hill, is they are covering up what they were doing in Ukraine. In Ukraine, they set up NABU, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, that was set up after the Maidan Revolution. And anybody can look at NABU's site and see this. NABU's got an FBI office in Kyiv, in their actual office. It's written right there. NABU were the people who released the documents that got Manafort fired from the Trump campaign. And explicitly, they were posted on the NABU site. So that's a U.S. setup. Biden was involved in that. George Kent was involved in that. I don't have the guy's name right now, but I got it in my notes, who was specifically coordinating between the embassy and NABU. And what they were doing was two things. Number one, if you listen to the criticism of Putin, he gets criticized for Syria, he gets criticized for Ukraine, which was a setup. And I'll mention this too. I had a friend who was in the NSA. And before I was working in politics, I wasn't really paying attention. I was reporting a little bit, but not on Ukraine. And when the Maidan was going on, he said to me, you watch, after the government topples, Putin's going to go into Crimea. So a guy who worked at the NSA knew that and told it to me because he was my friend growing up. And so this was, and later I was like, oh, okay, that's why he told me that. They knew what was going to happen, which was when they said we're going to go in and start killing people in Crimea, they knew that Putin wasn't going to let that happen. They had the election in Crimea. Overwhelmingly, they voted to go with Russia because they didn't want to be ethnically cleansed, as they knew these Banderites do. That's what they know that they do. And so this was used to demonize Putin, and it's still used to put sanctions on him and everything else. And if you look, the people in Kiev were much worse off, and the people in Crimea were much better off. And that's objectively. Eva Bartlett just went over to Crimea. We had her on the show. But a zillion, when you go to YouTube and look it up, no one can deny things are better in Crimea, things are worse in Kyiv. Why? Because the only thing we were trying to do in Kyiv was to antagonize Russia. Remember, after the Cold War ended, we said we're not going to bug you guys. Kyiv is right in Russia's literal backyard. It's right next door. And part of this is, again, to get Putin in a position where he can be taken out of power. Either if they can do it democratically, great. If they can't do it democratically, they'll do it any way that they can. And so that's the operation that we're seeing going on right now. And everything you're seeing on Capitol Hill is a cover-up for that. But this is created by the same small group of people. And as I say, nothing I'm telling you here, it's all, everything I'm saying. Go read Nunez's article. Go read what Victoria Nuland said on Face the Nation. You'll see they admit to all of this stuff. So it's a very, very interesting story. To me, it's a case study in the success of CIA disinformation. They have done an incredible job of fooling not just Trump's enemies. This is not about Trump, which is why, by the way, why the Tulsi Gabbard attacks are so important. it really shows the target. When Hillary Clinton came out and said Tulsi Gabbard's a Russian asset, that showed it has nothing to do with Trump's immigration policy or healthcare or anything. It has to do with the few politicians who even sort of call this stuff out. And Tulsi's better than Trump at it. But you can see Trump's not comfortable. You know, he brought Bolton in, but then he fired him. Any politician that shows any independence whatsoever, they need to take out. And they're desperately afraid right now because the internet and sites like yours have made it possible for people to learn the truth about this stuff. And 20 years ago, we could have been having this conversation on a park bench. And if I'd said to you, well, Lebed and the CIA, you just would have gone, well, how am I supposed to confirm that? Now everybody can just grab their phone and type in Lebed CIA and go, okay, well, that's what he's talking about. He's right.
Tell
That's
us again
right.
who Lebed was, Lee.
Yeah, Nicole Lebed was the reason I mentioned Lebed is it shows the long connection of the CIA to Ukraine. He was a war criminal in World War II, a Banderite, part of the Stepan Bandera factions, and literally responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Poles and Jews in World War II. Vicious, brutal war criminal who died in Pittsburgh, protected by the CIA right up until his death. Even when reporters from the Village Voice tried to say, hey, this guy, you got to remember, a lot of the most vicious guards during the Holocaust, they were all Ukrainian. The worst guards were Ukrainian as well. So I'm not dissing Ukrainians as a people. I'm just saying that's a fact. There is this real violent, brutal war criminal aspect.
He was one of many fascists brought back to the U.S. John Luftus, you must know about his work.
Yes.
Exposed. I think that's where I know about Lebed, from his book. But there was a whole, of course, they got Gehlen, the Nazi chief, to come on board if he turned over the buried Nazi files and whatnot. It's a horrific fear you're telling us.
And one of the reasons Lebed's important, by the way, is that the other big factor in this whole thing is George Soros. And the reason I say that is Soros, even before he formed Open Society, a lot of people think, oh, the Soros he's a boogeyman for the right. Well, no. So he formed International Renaissance. He is one of the major players here. And let's talk about Lebed. International Renaissance was started at the urging of Lebed allies. Lebed's people came to Soros and said, you need to start, and don't forget, Lebed was working with the CIA. So Lebed's people came to Soros and said, you need to start this big NGO. And so I think a case could be made pretty strongly that someone should investigate whether the whole Soros operation was in fact just a CIA front, just a different face of what the CIA was doing, keeping contacts there with people like Lebed. But he's only significant to me because he shows how long the CIA's history of working with Ukraine is. And it goes back, like I say, to the 50s. It's amazing. Right after the formation of the CIA, basically.
Lee, before we go on to more current things in terms of what's happening in the impeachment and where Ukraine figures and what Trump was doing, I need to drop a bombshell here. And full disclosure, I took over Consortium News on April 1st, 2018. I looked at the sheet of who the board members were, and there was a man named Cody Sheera on there.
Whoa!
I don't know who the hell he was. But when that new Washington Post story came out that said that he'd written the P-tape, the idea of what happened in the Moscow hotel with Trump, that this was opposition research. He was a Clinton operative going way back. I didn't know it was that far back, 68. I've learned that tonight. That he was an operative and he'd written this, and there are other people who've accused him of doing all kinds of dirty tricks for the Clintons. That's the way the game is played here in Washington on both sides. He was happened to be a Clinton operative. He was on the board, and when I pressed to get him removed, he refused. It took us a long time, but we finally got him off the board when I found out who he is, and particularly what role he was. Now, he was brought onto Consortium News a couple of years earlier. I don't know exactly when, actually, but it was the idea. Well, somebody sold Bob Perry on the idea that he had connections to the Clintons, and that he would be a good source for articles, stuff like that.
He definitely has connections to the Clintons. You know, the other guy who I mentioned, that's huge. That's really interesting. So Alexandra Chalupa is the DNC operative. Ken Vogel and David Stern wrote a story in January 2017, right before the inauguration, January 11th. And they went over how Chalupa had coordinated with the Ukrainian embassy to dig up dirt on Trump. That's the election collusion and interference we've been hearing so much about, except it was done by Chalupa and the Democrats before the DNC hack, before the Trump Tower meeting, months before. This is what started it, except she'd gone back. She was interested in Manafort. And she's the one who helped take out Paul Manafort. By the way, Roger Stone is on trial right now. She's helping to take him out. Whatever you think of Manafort, why is the guy who's convicted on tax charges under a gag order? Well, I'll tell you another enemy of hers, Julian Assange. And you can see this in an interview Alexandra Chalupa did in June of this year on Gaslit Nation with her sister. She hates Assange, hates him. And I'm going to notice, I'm going to just, for the record, people she hates tend to end up in prison with a gag order. Now, another guy she worked with is this guy, Eric Charmella, who people say may be the whistleblower. But what I know for sure is he invited her to the White House in September, I believe, of 2016. And she was right involved in this operation. Chalupa, and what's interesting about that, she made that claim on her Facebook page. And it sounds nonsensical, except a couple months later, different states started saying, hey, our voting systems were scanned against we did not allow it. And at first they blamed it on Russia, of course, but then they found out that the IP addresses came from the Department of Homeland Security. So what Chalupa had said on her Facebook page, and it's still live, I think, but you can find it on archive.org. What she said was the DHS, the DOJ, and this anonymous group are working to scan states' voting systems. Her sister said it 2 days later. Her sister, Andrea, confirmed it on Twitter. Then a few months later, it turns out, in fact, states' voting systems were being scanned with IPs that came from the Department of Homeland Security. What's up with that? So Alexandra Chalupa may be called. That's what I want to hear her talk about. She's never addressed that. She said it herself. But I also know, because I interviewed a guy named Yanni Schwartz, and that's what this article in BuzzFeed was about, that Chalupa was working to keep Trump from being sworn in with money that seems to be laundered through the DHS. They brought this guy, Yanni Schwartz, over from Israel. They went up to Capitol Hill. They talked to Keith Ellison. They talked to Marcy Kapoor up there, and Kaptur, and they were trying to keep Trump from taking office. And Isikoff knew about this. I've talked to Michael Isikoff. Isikoff was working with Chalupa throughout the election. In fact, Isikoff called her one of the most, right before the election, he said she's one of the most influential people. And she admits to it. And the reason she's so pissed at Assange, by the way, is the smoking gun for Chalupa was the WikiLeaks email. Anybody can find Ali Chalupa, if you type in Ali, like Muhammad Ali, short for Alexandra, Ali Chalupa WikiLeaks, you'll find the email. That's the definitive proof. She sent an email to Luis Miranda telling him that she'd been coordinating with Ukrainian journalists and Isikoff. She said that. WikiLeaks released it. She talks in that interview I mentioned about how pissed off she was at Assange. But let me mention the thing that I think you'll find very interesting, Elizabeth. So about 6-7 months ago, it was the night of the White House Correspondents' Dinner. And I was out covering it a little bit, and then I passed out and ended up in the hospital, but that's beside the story. So I was only there for a little bit. I was outside. But also outside was Cassandra Fairbanks, who's pissed at me, but I know Cassandra a little bit. And she's obviously a big fan of Assange. So Luis Miranda was walking. Now remember, Luis Miranda's the comms director that Alexandra Chalupa was coordinating with. He sees Cassandra and he starts yelling about Assange out of like nowhere, Luis Miranda, the comms director, starts screaming about, I'm glad Assange is in prison and that kind of stuff, like taunting Cassandra.
The comms director of the Clinton campaign.
That's weird. Yeah. No. Comms director of the DNC.
Oh, the DNC, right.
Except it was the Clinton campaign.
Right. right.
Well, no, I want to be very specific. In September 2015, the joint fundraising agreement was signed secretly between the Hillary Clinton campaign and the DNC. We know that because it was reported in November 2017. Everybody reported it. Here's the secret fundraising agreement. So everybody can go see it. The Sanders campaign knew nothing about it. One of the things that it specifies, the only position that they specify it's got to be one of two people is comms director. I'm going to say that again. In the secret agreement where the Hillary Clinton campaign took over the DNC, they said the comms director needs to be one of two people that we pick. About 3 weeks later, Luis Miranda was named as comms director. Therefore, he's the guy put in place by the Clinton campaign. And nobody knew it at the time. Everybody
he
thought
had to resign. Sorry, Lee, he had to resign, didn't he? With Schultz.
Yes.
He was one of the 5 or 6 who had to when the WikiLeaks releases came out, just before the convention, correct?
Yes, that's exactly
why he
right.
hates Julian Assange. That's pretty obvious.
He was part of that purge. Yeah, but I think the thing you're so pissed at. And by the way, if you go back, this Ukraine story has actually been going around for two years. I've been talking about it for 2.5 years. When the Washington Post and CNN tried to cover it up, they make no mention. You can go back and find it. Conspicuously, they leave out that WikiLeaks email. They never mention it. And they just go, well, it's a theory that she was coordinating. No, it's not a theory. It's right there in the WikiLeaks email. And the reason they're so pissed, and I really honestly believe it's part of why Assange is in trouble. I really believe this. I think there's clearly stuff with Pompeo, clearly that he's got a grudge against him, blah, blah, blah. But part of it, I believe, is covering this up. Because let's think about it. Julian Assange is a guy who could solve the whole Russian hack story immediately. If you want to figure out what was going on there, he could solve it. And he's offered to. But there's a massive cover-up going on. And Manafort, like I say, Manafort's part of it too. The reason they're gagging Manafort is Manafort actually understands Ukraine, and he was never pro-Russia. He was pro-EU. And they lie about Manafort constantly and make him out to be pro-Russian. That's one of the tricks that they do, is they don't want anyone to have a clear idea of like who's pro-Putin, who's anti-Putin. Everybody's Putin's cook or his friend or his favorite oligarch or whatever. And it's not, everybody can't be Putin's best friend. So it's an amazing smear operation, but it's not really aimed at Trump. It's really aimed at Putin, and it's really aimed at the American people because it's really aimed at getting a lot of money to Jacob Rothschild from those shares in Yukos. And you can see that in this article in Khodorkovsky in 2003 in the Times that spells out how he's buying his way into Russia. And by the way, that article quotes Fiona Hill, who I just mentioned, was at Brookings. She was at Brookings when that article came out. She's an expert on Khodorkovsky.
What is George Kent's role? George Kent, the State Department guy who testified on Wednesday to the impeachment hearing, he said some absolutely ridiculous things. Either it seemed like he actually believes what he was saying, which is hard for me to believe, or he's completely cynical. But he was saying that Fiona Hill, because she was born in Britain, and 2 others who I don't remember, who are also born in other countries but served on the National Security Council, were like Lafayette, who had been foreign-born but came to help the United States. I mean, the sanctimoniousness on this hearing and talking about the revolution and the Constitution is beyond stomaching for me. But tell me a little bit more about George Kent. You said when we were off the air earlier that he played a big role. He's playing a big role in this impeachment process. How is that?
So I talked about Kent about 9 months ago in March. And it's up on Twitter. I said, George Kent is the center of this. He was the guy on the ground running things, like coordinating between the embassy, coordinating with people connected to Soros's NGOs. International Renaissance is not just an NGO. It's like an incubator of NGOs. And all the relevant people here relate to it. So Kent was one of the operations guys. And that's part of the reason he's up there. Ukraine was a massive operation. And I was saying this morning to Igor Lopatnik. By the way, there's a new film. If anyone wants to get into this stuff deep, it's on Amazon Prime now. It's called Revealing Ukraine, and I'm in it. And you'll hear me in 2017 talking about Chalupa. And I play, no offense, but I play, Igor said this, the Robert Perry role. The first film that Igor made was called Ukraine on Fire, and it featured the great Robert Perry. And Perry's the guy who's the journalist in the film. That's what he meant by the Ukraine role. Not that I'm Perry, but that Perry's role in the first movie was to be the journalist to sit there and explain things to you. So I'm that guy in this film, Revealing Ukraine. And it's a follow-up. If anyone wants to understand Ukraine in about 4 hours, watch Ukraine on Fire, then watch Revealing Ukraine. He gets into, in Revealing Ukraine, the Biden stuff. He gets into the cover-up stuff. I talk about the Chalupa stuff. I talk about Civil Society 2.0. I get into detail. And it just came out yesterday morning on Amazon. So now if you're a Prime member, you can watch it for free. Otherwise, I think it's $5 or something.
That's
but anybody,
great. I'm going to do that. I'm sorry, go on.
Well, no, I was just going to say that really is when I didn't know anything about Ukraine until I saw Ukraine on Fire. And then I did what I do when I watch a movie like that is while I'm watching it, I'm going, well, I've never heard about that. And I look it up and I go, okay, well, that's true. I never heard about that. Okay, that's independently verified. And I was blown away by the stuff Perry was saying. And that whole movie gives such a deep history of Ukraine in a very short period of time that I watched it twice and then had everybody I knew watch it. And then Revealing Ukraine gets into the stuff we're seeing right now. And it was made 2 years ago. It just came out, but it was made 2 years ago.
What does it say about Biden's son and getting this job?
Well, it's so here's the thing about Hunter Biden. It's a distraction in that Hunter Biden making a lot of money is like 50th on my list of important things in Ukraine. The whole coup part, the backing Nazis part, let's put those up higher, right? So that being said, it's such an obvious case of corruption. Here's somebody completely unqualified to be in this position, making a tremendous amount of money, and he's the vice president's son. That's prima facie corrupt. I don't know how else to say it. Like that is like the definition of corruption. If you said this unqualified person who's the son of a leader was put on the board and is making 50 grand a month, where people make like 500 a month, because Ukraine's the poorest country in Europe.
And it's evidence of nepotism, and it follows a coup in which his father played a major role.
That's right, but it's not the worst thing. You know what I'm saying? Like to me, it's almost like when you have diplomats who double park because they have diplomatic immunity. Okay, yeah, I know. It's bad. It's irritating. If they park your car in, it's the worst thing in the world. But it's when diplomats use diplomatic immunity to spy and murder people, that's a bigger issue. So the Hunter Biden issue, this is why the media loves it. Super easy to understand. And Biden gets to go, no laws were broken. And he's probably right, I guess. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's entirely possible no laws were broken there.
Well, he withheld $1 billion in U.S. aid to get the prosecutor fired, who that prosecutor under oath in a case in Vienna has said was he was fired because Biden's pressure was put on Poroshenko because he was going to investigate this company.
Yeah,
right?
And so then yes, but
you don't see that in the New York Times, by the way. Go on.
Well, no, I agree. And the fact that we have Biden on video sounding like a thug, I don't know how else to put it, bragging, sounding like a mafia guy bragging at a restaurant on Saturday night. So I told him, you got 6 hours. Make up your mind. What are you going to do? You call the president? Call him. Go ahead. You pick up the phone. You call him. I mean, that's the way Biden comes off. 100%. That's literally what he's saying. Now, go ahead. Call him. See what happens. Right? So he's like trying out for a new Scorsese film or something like that. And but it's a distraction from the coup and the takeover of the Ukraine government and the installation of Naboo and the election interference, which is, here's what happened. This is real easy, actually. Hillary Clinton really wanted to be president. And there were people who really wanted her to be president. And so the first thing they did was they secretly took over the Democratic Party. Then, working with State Department CIA people, they set up mechanisms to not only try to keep Trump from taking office, but to, since the real goal was to demonize Putin, to associate Trump with Putin after the election too. That was their goal. That was the goal of the dossier. Because don't forget, the dossier didn't come out during the election. So,
Exactly. That brings me to a question I really want to ask you.
Yeah.
If I can just interrupt for a moment, please continue your line of thought if this is irrelevant. But I want to ask you, because you've spoken about the dossiers, the two of them, you've spoken about the collusion allegations and, you know, these various figures that are involved in it. What about Goose for Two? How do these figures play into that narrative? You know, how, to what extent is it connected to Ukraine as well? Just, I would like to hear your insight about that.
On which ones?
On the allegations of Russian hacking, based on the idea that this Goose for Two persona is somehow, a Russian hacker, sent directly by Putin. I mean, from my own personal perspective, I don't think that the DNC was hacked. I'm not saying it was never hacked. I'm saying that I don't think the Goose for Two persona was the result of a hack on the DNC. But I want to hear your perspective on whether any of these figures you've mentioned tonight were involved in the creation of that persona.
So the way I got down this very elaborate rabbit hole was when the accusations were made. I'll tell you what perked my interest. During the DNC, it came out, after the documents came out, that Donna Brazil had given the answers to questions to Hillary Clinton in a debate with Bernie Sanders. She was working at CNN. That was unethical. Okay, not the bad, but not the biggest thing in the world. But her response was fascinating to me, which is she said, well, we don't know if those emails are even real. They were hacked by the Russians. And I was like, well, that's a bizarre response, because first off, she should know. It turned out later she did do it. She later admitted it. But her first response was, we don't even know if those emails are real, and Russia. And I was like, well, that's weird. And so I started looking into the technical people, not the political people, but the technical people looking into the details of what was being called a Russian hack. And that was people like Jeffrey Carr, a guy who's head of a company called WordFence. And I was looking for people who didn't have a dog in the hunt, who weren't playing a political game, but are just like, here's what we know. Here's the way computers work. There you go. And nobody technically thought any of that made sense. Any of the standard narrative. And the thing that was really weird to me was that Goose for Two came out. And I think it's entirely possible Russia or any other state actor would hack things. So let's just say
no one's going to deny that. I think that's a very basically, true.
Governments do that.
Right.
But what they don't do is they don't create a fake persona and create a Twitter account and then speak at a London hackers conference telephonically or electronically and create a WordPress page.
Exactly.
What they do is, if I were Russia or if I were any country, I'd get the stuff and I would back channel it to Assange. And then it just appears.
And it's
right. Because every single time you tweet, you run the risk of someone figuring out who you are. Every single time that you have any communications like that. So it never made sense to me technically. Then I started to look into it. And I was talking to all these tech people who are like, this makes absolutely no sense. And so then I ended up ghostwriting a piece for Roger Stone. I was working at Breitbart at the time. And nobody at the time, Goose for Two was out there and had done interviews with like the Smoking Gun, like 5 or 6 journalists, was very active on Twitter, talking to people. Hey, I'm Goose for Two, everybody. I did this hack.
DMing people, the works. Yeah.
Right. All these people. And I was like, okay, well, let me see if I can figure this out. So Ghost wrote a piece under Roger's name. And I said, everybody's saying it's the Russians, but you got to remember, this is before they did a switcheroo later. They said, oh, the Russians are Goose 2. That's
Right.
not what they said at first. All the media reporting completely ignored the existence of Goose 2, like Goose didn't exist. So I wrote an article under Roger's name. He didn't know anything about this stuff. And I said, why is everybody blaming it on Russia when Goose 2's over here going, hi, it's me. Hi, it's me. Subsequently, I got in touch with Goose 2, who I still don't know who it is. And I have various guesses, but I don't know who it is. And I don't really know what happened. What I know is what didn't happen, which is I know that the Democrats were making these accusations before this happened. I know that Alexandra Chalupa said that she began receiving alerts that were disturbing, that said from Yahoo. She tried to sign into her email and it said, a state actor may have compromised your account. And that she went to Michael Isikoff, who reported in his book, Russian Roulette, that this was the first sign of Russian hacking targeted at somebody who was going after Manafort. But then I also know that she says in that interview, Gaslit Nation, that that message had gotten caught up in her spam folder and that she'd actually gotten it in September of 2015. And so then I look up Yahoo, September 2015, state actor, and I find out that Yahoo had sent out tens of thousands of emails, that it was not targeted at her at all. It
Wow.
was the CTO, the chief technical officer of Yahoo, did a blog post about it. Anybody can find this. So I know that that's all a misunderstanding turned into a lie, but it's a lie. When Isikoff's reporting that, he's lying, period. He's lying. He knows. All you have to, it was not hard to find the research. And Chalupa admits that so you find out when exactly it is. So there was nothing going on there. They created this narrative out of whole cloth. And she said to people at the Ukrainian embassy, we're going to have hearings on Trump Russia in March or April, late March, let's call it, of 2016. Why would you have hearings on Trump Russia? The Washington Post story didn't come out until June 14th. Nobody knew about a hack or anything like that. So this was all a setup. And then when you look into the Sheera dossier and why everyone refers to it as the second dossier, when it chronologically came first, from the people closest to the Clintons for 50 years. And when those same people like Brett Kimberlin, who worked in 92 with Cody Sheera, so that it ended up in this whole thing where I had to learn about Ukraine and stuff like that. But from a technical perspective, it never made any sense to me at all whatsoever. Like, why would Russia act that way? Why would Russia act like a 19-year-old boy? I don't know how else to put it. Like,
so Lee, are there any Republicans in this House impeachment process going to bring up any of this, particularly the Black Ledger? Could you tell us more about that? Are they going to talk about any of this, or are they just going to let it die in the Senate and he won't be convicted?
I assume they're not. And the reason I assume they're not is Devin Nunes is a bad guy. And again, I'm not leave policy and everything else aside. I'm talking about in this story, he's a fierce advocate for the Magnitsky Act. And so here's the way it works on the right. The story on the right is, they call it Spygate. So the story on the left is pretty easy. Mainstream media, it's Russiagate. It's Trump's a bad guy, Putin's a bad guy, and they colluded on the 2016 election. And Mueller just needs to catch him or whatever. That's the right short version. The Republican version is called Spygate. In this version, Trump's a good guy, Putin's a bad guy, and they didn't collude on the 2016 election, but Russia still did the hack. Russia's still bad in every way. And so the only difference is one of them goes, see, and Trump did it, and the other one goes, no, he didn't, but both of them agree that Putin's bad. And Nunes, and so how do they get away with that? why don't people talk about Cody Sheera or Strobe Talbot? Because they talk about Glenn Simpson and Fusion GPS. And so the Republican talking point on this, on Fox constantly, John Solomon does it, Dan Bongino does it, all these guys constantly, Fusion GPS, Fusion GPS, Fusion GPS, ignoring the fact that Steele wasn't hired until May or June, and that Cody was talking about this in March, and it came first. And it was the template for the Steele dossier, period. That was. And so the reason I mention this is because Devin Nunes recently sued Glenn Simpson for $9.9 million and said he's going to get Simpson. And part of the reason he said he's going to get Simpson is because of the lies he told about Bill Browder and the Magnitsky Act. Now, I didn't even get into that, but the Magnitsky Act, Bill Browder, that was like a crucial point here. That was put together by Jonathan Weiner, who was being briefed by Steele. And this has been the chief weapon in the new Cold War. Now, this Magnitsky Act, if you read it, if you actually look at the text of the law, sponsored by John McCain and Ben Cardin, promoted by Devin Nunes at the time, 2012, the Magnitsky Act mentions, remember I said back at the beginning, Yukos Oil? Go look at the Magnitsky Act. It's not about human rights. It says one of the goals of this law is to protect the American investors in Yukos Oil. It says it right in the Magnitsky Act. And so Nunes is in the tank on that. And all Bill Browder is he's a shill who comes out because he was raised in America. He's an American. And he renounced his U.S. citizenship. Fox never tells you that. And by the way, when I say Fox is, I'll tell you who else is in the tank is Glenn Beck. And here's what I mean by in the tank. When Putin and Trump met in Helsinki, and I was there, and suddenly I'm getting all these texts from people. They're like, hey, they just mentioned Browder. You've been talking about Browder for a year. Bill Browder appeared on Fox after around the week around Helsinki 8 times. And Fox News anchors, who would you think they'd take the side of? Donald Trump or versus anybody, right? Like, so just name anybody. John Smith. You'd go, well, I'm going to assume Fox takes the side of Donald Trump because that's what they do, right? They're a pro-Trump organization. They took the side of Bill Browder consistently. Glenn Beck said he had Browder on his show. It's up on YouTube. I'm not in favor of impeachment generally, but if he goes ahead with this against you, I'm going to want him impeached. Beck says that. So all of these guys on the right are completely in the tank for Bill Browder. Sarah Carter has referred to him as her friend, Bill Browder. On Fox and Friends, they go, Bill, are you okay? We just want to make sure you're doing okay. They are in the tank. And why are they in the tank? Because Browder is connected up the line to Khodorkovsky, Yukos Oil. Browder was in on that scam. And this is all about getting the money out of Yukos Oil. If they can denationalize it, a lot of people make a lot of money. And if they have to spend $10 billion to make 13, they've made 3. You see what I'm saying? So I don't think they really look at the cost here because it's got to be astronomical. But that's what they're looking at. So Nunes is a bad guy. And I'm not going to have much luck convincing the average Fox viewer of that right now. But it's provable. He's fully on board with this Magnitsky thing. And the fact that Fox is so in the tank for Browder, I say this all the time. I'll mention 3 things about Browder that are actually inconsequential. He comes from the most prominent communist family in the country. His grandfather, Earl Browder, was the head of the U.S. Communist Party. So what? That doesn't mean actually, I know logic well enough to know that that doesn't mean anything. But when they never mention it on Fox, I know what they're up to. Because you could easily excuse it. You could go, here's Bill Browder. His grandfather was a communist, but he's the ultimate capitalist. That's what he says. They never mention that. And the reason they never mention he renounced his citizenship. They never mention he's a lifelong Democrat, which the New York Times reported. Why? Because the Fox executives know if they say, hey, here's our friend Bill Browder, his grandfather Earl Browder is head of the Communist Party, that immediately a lot of Fox people would go, wait a minute. And again, it's illogical. I understand that, but I understand that the effect it would have. And that's why they never mention it. They never mention he renounced his US citizenship, which he did. They never mention that he's a lifelong Democrat, which he is, and he hates Trump, which he's smart enough never to bring up on Fox. So on Fox, they'll go like, so this guy, Glenn Simpson, you know, what has he got against Trump? They're like, it's a Fox level question. Literally, it's like that level. And Bill will go, well, you can watch it. Well, I don't know about that, John, but I do know that he did lie about me. You see what I'm saying? So it's a non-answer answer. He sort of pretends to answer, doesn't say anything negative or positive about Trump. He'll never say anything positive about him. And then pivots and says, but Glenn Simpson's a bad guy. And the Fox audience is so convinced that they don't see what just happened. They go, okay, this Glenn Simpson, he is a bad guy. He is against Trump. I don't like him. This Bill Browder's agreeing with that. I agree with him. So it's really a masterful information operation, getting the Fox team to be completely in the bag, but they have 13.5 billion reasons to do it. So,
well, Fox has been pretty strident against the impeachment, and they featured Giuliani quite often at the beginning when he was going to Ukraine as Trump's defense attorney to gather information about the origins of Russiagate and also the operation against Trump, if there was one, in particular this Black Ledger thing. Can we end with you telling us a little bit about that?
Sure, and that's significant because I called, again, anyone can look on Twitter. I was saying to Solomon and Giuliani, what are you guys doing? You're getting the story completely wrong. It's a limited hangout. I said this in March. So here's what happened. In August, mid-August of 2016, a story came out, and in the New York Times, Andrew Kramer broke the story, that this Black Ledger was being introduced that showed payments to Manafort. And within about 3 days, Manafort was gone from the Trump campaign. Now, that incident, claiming that Manafort's signature was found in this Black Ledger, came from a guy named Sergei Leschenko. I've interviewed Leschenko. I've talked to him privately as well. And Leschenko is a complete Soros shill. Soros has lunch with him every time he's there. He's backed by Pinchuk, who's one of Hillary Clinton's biggest supporters, and he's backed by Soros. And that doesn't mean he's a liar, but he's a liar, and it explains that he's a liar. So he came out with this, and all these pictures of him posing, he's got the Black Ledger. Now that information came from NABU, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine. It was actually released on their website. Anybody can go find it. Later, it turned out, and I'd been reporting this for about a year before Solomon got involved. I'd been saying that, look, here's what's happening. That Black Ledger was 3 months after the election. I forget when it was. I want to say March 2017, and I could be right, but right after the election, Ukraine came out and said, oh, that Black Ledger, no, that wasn't, Manafort's name wasn't in that. That was completely false. Oops, sorry. But the damage had been done. Manafort had been pulled out of the campaign. Now, Chalupa was behind that because she was targeting Manafort from 2015. But the big thing that happened was NABU, which had an FBI office in it. Now, why did Solomon report it? First off, Solomon's never reported about the FBI office in NABU. That's very significant. So the other thing that Solomon did was he found this guy, Lutsenko, who was the guy that Joe Biden had put in place. So Giuliani, who's a complete shill, and I mean literally will do anything for a check. There are pictures of Rudy with Poroshenko over there. Rudy's a guy who will do anything for a check. But he'd started to get wind of this because I'd been talking about it like literally every day or week, probably every day on my show. I talk about Ukraine stuff like literally every day. Chalupa every day. And I had pointed out how Fox, in particular Solomon, was being used as a way straight into Trump's brain. Here's how it goes. So let's say you want Trump to order a cheese omelet. I'll tell you the way to do it. You get John Solomon to run a story about cheese omelets. Then Sarah Carter goes, right, cheese omelets. Then he's on Hannity that night doing a segment about cheese omelets. Sean Hannity, here's our special guest, John Solomon. Then that night or the next day, you'll see Trump go, I could go for a cheese omelet right now. It's the easiest thing in the world. Literally, the information pipeline goes Solomon, Carter, Bongino, sometimes Rudy, Hannity. Then, because Fox watches Hannity, Trump watches Hannity, then he'll tweet out about it. And I had noticed this over and over and over again. And I started saying it very blatantly. I said, John Solomon is a disinformation conduit to get into Trump's brain. So Solomon will say, well, the visa that the Russian lawyer used to go to the Trump Tower meeting, which he said, she was given that by the Department of Justice. That's a lie. It's not true. It's a little more complex than that, but that's a lie. It was not true. And Solomon knows better. And Solomon's a complete Browder shill, completely in the bag. You'll see he's always in favor of the Magnitsky Act and Browder and everything else. So I had noticed this about Solomon, and I had very explicitly been calling him out, like saying, he is a shill, he is lying, here's how he's lying. Suddenly, Solomon comes out with this stuff with Lutsenko. And suddenly a lot of people on the Fox audience, and I've been saying, why have not you guys mentioned Fox? Hey, Fox, why have you never told your audience that the Black Ledger was found to be false? Why you never told them? Suddenly, John Solomon to the rescue. He comes in with the Lutsenko interview. And I said, why are you interviewing Lutsenko? He's the guy who let Hunter Biden off. He's a bad guy. He's the guy who Biden put into place. And I said it to Giuliani, and I said it to Solomon on Twitter multiple times. I said on my radio show, I went nuts about it. And then they've sort of modified their limited hangout. But since every part of this story is so completely and blatantly true, like all you'd have to do is read the Jonathan Weiner thing and go, well, we need to get this guy up on the Hill to testify. He needs to explain a few things. Nobody's, Dan Bongino, this guy I go after all the time, he's done 2 books on Russiagate, 2 books. He's never mentioned Strobe Talbot's name once. And when people point it out, he blocks them. So there's a massive disinformation campaign going on the left. And the media right now is so...
So who do you allege is running John Solomon, is feeding John Solomon to do this? He's initiating on his own?
Browder.
Well,
you can... Yeah.
Okay, we're going to have to, Elizabeth, if you want to finish with a few questions, because we really are running over time.
Well,
I know, it's my fault.
Well, I've been taking a look at your Twitter feed over the last couple of days, and I was thinking of a kind of a big picture, bird's eye view type statement / question to end the evening, at least as far as I'm concerned with, and to say, would you agree that looking at the role of the CIA in a lot of the stuff that you've been talking about this evening in Ukraine, et cetera, would you say that in your opinion, and looking especially at how far back that goes, I remember you were saying earlier this evening, all the way back to the 50s. In your opinion, is the CIA one of the most evil entities that has ever existed on this planet? The amount of people it's either killed directly, indirectly, or supported, mass murderers, torturers, and etc.
So, yes, but further.
Please go ahead.
I know that did not sound like the kind of statement that I would go and further.
Yes.
But I said this tonight, actually. What we're seeing right now is the most obvious power. It's not even a power grab. I'm 100%, it's clear to me, the CIA took over in 1963. So a couple of years before I was born. The Kennedy assassination, Arthur Kroc wrote a month before the Kennedy assassination that Kennedy was worried that if a coup ever came from any place in the country, it would come from the CIA. Harry Truman wrote about the CIA a month after the Kennedy assassination in the Washington Post, which the Washington Post only ran once, didn't run in the evening edition. And Harry Truman said, the CIA is out of control. It's a month after the Kennedy assassination. So the only conclusion I can come to when I watch people like John McLaughlin, former CIA director, say, thank God for the deep state. And when I watch John Brennan brag about the CIA's role, And when we know for a fact that this whistleblower is a CIA analyst in Langley, many believe to be named Eric Charmella, but that's kind of irrelevant because it's a CIA analyst. The CIA runs this country, and they run foreign policy. Now, I can say that bluntly. Then if we want to go, okay, so, but who's running the CIA? Is it the Rothschilds or whatever? To me, that's a certain amount of paperwork that we can figure out later. They're all really bad. Like, are the Clintons running the CIA or is the CIA running the Clintons? Whatever. They're all bad. They're all connected. They're clearly connected here. And they're blatantly saying that the president doesn't run foreign policy. And so I've had I'm a slight Obama revisionist. And I guess I could be a slight revisionist for almost, aside from the Bushes and Clinton, for every president, and go, Obama didn't run foreign policy, and Trump doesn't run foreign policy either. And why is every media outlet afraid to say Eric Charmella's name? And why is every congressperson afraid to say Eric Charmella's name? It's because they know what you just said, which is the CIA really runs things. They're not even hiding it anymore. And so to me, it becomes the only question at this point is, are people going to be brave enough to say, you know what? This is an open CIA coup. This is open. They're not even hiding it. We see politicians literally too afraid to name a fairly low-level CIA analyst in Langley. Why? Why? Why would they be? Because they're afraid. That's why did Adam Schiff today say, I don't know who the whistleblower's name is?
Because there's 7 ways from Sunday. Lee.
Yeah. Yeah. So to me, I didn't quite, there was one point in covering this story. I'm really blessed because I host a radio show for 3 hours a day and I get to pick the guests. And so if I'm trying to figure out stuff about the CIA, I can bring in John Kiriakou or Phil Giraldi or Ray McGovern. Or if I want to figure out the Kennedy assassination, I can bring in Jefferson Morley. If I want to figure out the UN, I can bring in Joe Laurier, right? You see. So I've been very, very lucky in the sense that I have this radio show. And for some reason that I couldn't put my finger on, I started really getting into the Kennedy assassination stuff a few months into this. I'm seeing what's happening here. And I think for some reason, it's important for me to read the work. I'm making it sound a little woo-woo. It's not. I kept seeing these connections to the CIA. And I realized that I didn't really understand history. And then reading James, the book, The Ghost by Jefferson Morley, a great short book. If anybody wants to read about the history of James Angleton, you can read it in a night or two. It's a very short book, but it's packed full of information. And that book started to make me go, okay, wait a minute. What's really happening in this country? What's really been happening as long as I've been alive? Like since before I was born. And I realized there was so much history that I didn't know. And I consider myself an educated, whatever. I consider myself more educated than average. And I didn't know any of it. And I talked to friends of mine and I'm like, hey, do you know about Mary Pinchot Meyer? And they were like, no, I have no idea. Like all these things that are peripheral, but they're not peripheral to the central story, which is the CIA runs things. In the Mary Pinchot Meyer story, for instance, Ben Bradley, iconic Washington Post editor-in-chief, helped cover up her murder by hiding the diary and giving it to Angleton. He admits that. And so you just go like, well, wait a minute. I thought the Washington Post, but they broke Watergate. And I started looking stuff in Watergate and go, well, E. Howard Hunt from the CIA was one of the plumbers. And on his deathbed, he did admit to the assassination of President Kennedy, including Cord Meyer, Mary Pinchot Meyer's husband, who was in charge of Operation Mockingbird. And then you go, well, what's Operation Mockingbird? Let me look. Oh, my God. And you start to realize that we're really, I don't know how else to put it, but like we're living under propaganda. We're living, everybody around us is living with this false history And the people who've been reporting, and again, Consortium News has been writing, which is why it's fascinating that Cody, you did break that, and that's huge. That Cody Sheera was on the board, of course, because there's so few of us out there telling the truth right now, and I have them on my radio show. But there's not a lot of great media outlets. There's just not. But everybody gets a little bit right because not everybody's in on the operation, obviously. But yeah, the CIA is very, very, very dangerous. But are they more dangerous than Netanyahu, or I don't know? Maybe. Maybe. I'm just saying.
Yeah, well, we're talking about inside the U.S. right now. I think that was well said, and I will end by quoting William Casey, former CIA director, said, when the American people, that everything the American people believe is a lie, is when we know we've succeeded. And the woman in the room who heard that told Ray McGovern this, so that tells you quite a lot right there, that this is not by accident. And we're trying to unravel this, and to survive in this country mentally, intellectually, is a struggle against this constant disinformation, and difficult to relate to other people who've been brought up on it and have never questioned it. And that's a disturbing thing. But Lee, I'm sorry we have to leave it there, but we really thank you for all the time you gave us. Incredibly interesting insights, and we hope you come back again and talk. When the Senate is going to take up the impeachment, we'll have you back. How's that? That's great. Anytime. You guys know I'm a big fan of both your work, and thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lee.
Great discussion. Thank you.
Bye-bye.